Today's passage is Genesis 41:9-24. Let's read together. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first, but even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Amen. I will share a message with you today titled, Joseph Stands Before Pharaoh and Before God. Pharaoh was tormented. He was the most powerful man of his time, even called a god, but he was tormented because he could not interpret a dream he had. This fear led Joseph to where Pharaoh was, for only God could resolve Pharaoh's torment, and Joseph was the one connected to God. It is at this very point, the point of bringing Joseph before Pharaoh, that the dream is mobilized. The dream is used. In the Bible, a dream is not just a mysterious event, or as some say, a premonition that foresees the future. A dream is something humans cannot do, something humans cannot control. Therefore, a dream signifies something only God can do. Through that dream, through this work that only God can do, Joseph comes to meet Pharaoh. This meeting created the greatest turning point in Joseph's life. The chief cupbearer, who had been imprisoned and had met Joseph there, finally remembered Joseph. The Bible records that this happened after 2 full years. Faced with the problem of interpreting Pharaoh's dream, he remembered what he had long forgotten. Let's read verses 12 and 13 together. Let's read aloud. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. Amen. Recalling his past experience with Joseph, the cupbearer confessed, "Things turned out exactly as he interpreted them." However, there is one thing we must be careful about here. It is that this did not happen because of Joseph's request. In today's text, the cupbearer speaks to Pharaoh strictly about one thing, the dream. He says nothing about Joseph being unjustly imprisoned. Joseph's request was this: "When you get out of prison, please speak well of me to Pharaoh. I was carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing to be put in a dungeon." But in fact, the cupbearer does not convey most of this request to Pharaoh. It's not as if he told Pharaoh about Joseph's innocence because Joseph had done nothing to deserve being in prison, as Joseph had requested. He doesn't say, "There is a young man who was imprisoned without guilt." He simply says, "There is a man I know who can interpret dreams." He only brought up Joseph to Pharaoh because a dream interpreter was needed. Therefore, this was not something accomplished through Joseph's request, not something orchestrated by human effort. Also, the 2-year period is very important. Genesis 41 begins by stating clearly that 2 full years had passed since the cupbearer was restored to his position. This 2-year period emphasizes that this was not something achieved through a request. If this had happened to Joseph as soon as the cupbearer was released from prison, one might think it was orchestrated by people due to Joseph's request. But perhaps God waited 2 more years to emphasize, to show, Joseph, this did not happen because you asked something of Pharaoh or pleaded for him to get you out. I believe that is why. This is precisely why we must not rely on people, as I have mentioned before. If you make a request, it could be delayed by 2 years. If you try to resolve things with human cunning, it could take 2 more years. We must take this to heart this morning, because this kind of work is not the work of man. Although the chief cupbearer played an important role in bringing Joseph before Pharaoh, he was merely an instrument. It was not Joseph's request, but only God's delicate intervention that made it possible. In other words, God did all of this. Pharaoh finally summons Joseph. Let's read verse 15 together. Verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Amen. Pharaoh told Joseph that no one could interpret the dream he had, and he praised him saying, "But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Everyone, this very scene is the most important part of Joseph's life. This scene is the climax of Joseph's life. When Joseph heard these words of praise, "I have heard it said of you that you can interpret it," what must have been in his heart? In truth, it is not easy for ordinary people like us to empathize with Joseph's emotions at this moment. From the perspective of someone who had been locked in prison for over a decade and not for a crime but for being unjustly framed, these words, "I've heard you are able to interpret it," would have hit differently. One right answer to this statement could now change his life 180 degrees. This was the crossroads between getting out of prison and not. That is why I believe this scene, the moment Joseph answers Pharaoh's words, is the greatest turning point and the most important moment in Joseph's life. In fact, if we were to pick another important scene in Joseph's life, it could be when he fled from the temptation of Potiphar's wife. But that was a case of avoiding an obvious criminal act, and so it was merely a passive action. This time, however, it is completely different. Pharaoh's words, "I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it," could have been a far greater temptation than the physical temptation of Potiphar's wife. To the words, "I've heard you're so good at this," he could have replied, "Yes, that's what I do," or, "Yes, I've interpreted dreams for others, and I have never once failed." Even if he had said that, no one there would have challenged him. In that situation, Joseph held the upper hand. But how did Joseph answer? Joseph replies like this. Let's read verse 16 together. I believe this verse 16 is the single most important statement in Joseph's life. Let's read verse 16 together. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Amen. Joseph's answer is this: "It is not me." Was there really a need to deny himself at that moment? When it would have been natural to say, "I did it," was there any need to say, "It is not me"? The NIV English translation records this part even more dramatically. The NIV says, "I cannot do it." He says, "I cannot do it." At a time when he should have been saying, "Oh, I can do that, I'm good at that," or, "That's my specialty," what is Joseph saying? He is saying, "I cannot do it." And Joseph continues, "God will do it." Joseph's answer is this: "It is not I, it is God. I cannot do it. God will do it." This was Joseph's answer before Pharaoh, standing at the crossroads of whether or not he could leave the prison. At this crucial moment, before the very person who held the power to decide his fate, the power to release him from prison, Joseph does not speak of himself. Joseph speaks only of God. In fact, Joseph had previously tried to use the power of this very person, the power of Pharaoh, in a similar situation. When he made a request to the chief cupbearer, he had said, "Please speak well of me to Pharaoh." Now he had the chance to say it with his own mouth. It was a golden opportunity to make that request himself, not through a third party. At this moment, he surely should have promoted himself to get out of prison. But Joseph does not do so. This is the part of Joseph that changed during those 2 years. He is simply speaking of God. Regarding dream interpretation, Joseph consistently says, "Interpretation belongs to God. I cannot do it. God will give the answer." In prison and in the palace, Joseph speaks consistently in this way. He consistently speaks of God. And we see a changed man from 2 years prior, a man who has moved from asking favors of people to entrusting everything to God. It seems that Joseph is now filling the one remaining area he lacked before becoming prime minister, that he is now becoming qualified. God trained Joseph in this way for 2 more years. Dear beloved saints, confessing God did it for something God has done seems easy, but it is not always so. However, a person who can make this confession can receive the blessings God gives as true blessings. Becoming a prime minister, having power, these things seem like blessings, but they are like a double-edged sword that can easily become a curse. A blessing can easily turn into a curse. Knowing to stand on the side of truth even if it means a loss, and knowing to stand on God's side even if it means facing disadvantage and being sent back to prison. Growth, maturity, and change began at this very point, and were also completed at this very point. I bless you in the name of the Lord that today may be a day where you confess I cannot do it but God, because we do not stand only before Pharaoh, even in that moment we stand before God. Not I trying to solve the problem but God, not I trying to answer but God, not I trying to explain and interpret but God. I bless you in the name of the Lord that today you will make room for God to work, that you will rely on God and not man, and thus live a life where blessings become true blessings.